Scripture reading today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verses 13 to 21 and 31 to 35. Jesus went up the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the message, and to have authority to cast out demons. So he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, and Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaan, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And now down to verse 31. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Let the Holy Spirit speak to us and through Brian. Please come forward, Brian. God bless you.
Well, last week I introduced the new sermon series that we are going to be engaging during Lent, which is a study of the Gospel of Mark. And I believe I warned you that the Jesus of Mark is kind of a loose cannon. Now, of course, Jesus in all of the Gospels is a bold person who is not afraid to say controversial things. But at least for those of us who have been Christians for a while, I think generally when we're reading Matthew, Luke, and John, we've kind of gotten used to it. We recognize the theology of Jesus, the way he talks. We have ways of making sense of these things. But I find that when I'm reading Mark, even as someone who has been a Christian for a while, Jesus says things that surprise me, things that trouble me, things that make me uncomfortable. And if you weren't sure if I was exaggerating, I'm going to give you a great example of it this morning as we get started here, just in the 3rd chapter of Mark's Gospel, in which Jesus raises a question that is so uncomfortable that I've never really heard it seriously engaged from a pulpit. In any of the different kinds of churches that I've been a part of, not progressive churches, not conservative churches, not even my beloved countercultural Mennonite churches. It's a question that makes almost all Christians uncomfortable. And the question is our loyalty to Christ higher even than our loyalty to our family? To our parents, our spouses, our children? Or perhaps to put it another way, is it possible that our love for our own family members could come in the way of following Christ? Ugh. I don't like asking that. I don't like asking that for a number of reasons, but for one, because family is such a good and beautiful thing. Certainly, the Bible speaks about families in positive terms. God is the creator of families. God blesses families. God wants to see families reconciled and healed and to see them thrive. And it seems unhelpful to pit one good thing against another. But it's not me that's doing this. This is something that Jesus himself raises. And not just in the Gospel of Mark, I'll acknowledge. Perhaps the way that it comes out the most strongly is in a passage we find in Matthew and Luke. A passage in which Jesus just comes out and says, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." It's strange that these verses don't keep many of us up at night. Now, I think that probably the reason that that they don't bother us more, is because we can kind of say in the back of our minds, well, yes, God is supposed to be first. Yes, got it. But, of course, God is always going to want us to love our families, so there's not really any kind of contradiction here. But for some sensitive souls that really wrestle with these passages, this kind of stuff can be troubling. For example, there was an anonymous woman who wrote a letter to a Christian magazine called Catholic Weekly. This is a magazine that has kind of a back and forth editorial where you can ask questions to the priests on staff there and they would respond. And she wrote this: "I know we're supposed to love God above all things, but sometimes I think I have more love for my husband and children than for God. This worries me. What exactly does it mean to love God above all things?" And I appreciate the honesty in that, because I certainly can relate to those feelings. Most days I love God, but I have to be honest, there are days when I question God and days when I don't particularly like God very much. And there's hardly a day that goes by when I don't feel some close, deep bond to my family members. And so if I'm really wrestling about which love is deeper, that's a tough one to answer. Now, the priest was helpful in his response. He noted that there is a difference between love as a feeling and love as a commitment. He said that, we can't control our feelings necessarily. They go up and down each day, and it's natural to feel the closest around those who we can touch and see and feel. Whereas with God, what really matters is that we are more committed to God than to anybody else. That's a helpful answer. Maybe it put this particular contributor at ease, but I'm not sure if it necessarily resolves it for me. Because I'm not sure if I'm even more committed to God than to my family at times. Say, for example, if God put me in a position like God put Abraham, where God asked me to sacrifice one of my children, and somehow, contrary to every other experience I've had, I have this absolute confidence that this was God and that this was clearly what God wanted me to do, I think I'd say no. I don't think that I would do it. And in fact, I think it would bother me if I encountered other parents who would say yes to that question. Now, that's not a realistic situation. It's not something that people really confront very often, but I do think that it's realistic that there are senses in which parents sometimes feel that God is telling them to emotionally or socially sacrifice their children. There are people who find themselves in a situation where their kids have made some kind of a choice, taken on some kind of a lifestyle that is contrary to what they believe Christ calls us to do. And they wonder whether what God wants from them is to shun or disown their own children. And that's a troubling thought. That doesn't feel right or sit right with me. Is that what God is asking? Well, I think when we get off into all these hypothetical questions, we're starting to get away from the text and into this realm of speculation, right? There's no reason to think that Jesus was talking about disowning family members when he asks this question, when he makes this comment in Matthew. I think the best way to understand how Jesus wants us to interact with our families is to consider his teaching in light of the way that he lived his own life, in light of the way that he interacted with his family. And if we're reading the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, or John, we're in luck, because we know that with at least one family member, his mother, Jesus had a very positive relationship. We read in the Gospel of Matthew that Mary was selected to be the virgin mother of Jesus and that she embraced this role. The Gospel of Luke echoes that and goes further, letting us know that Mary was actually among the disciples who followed Jesus through his death and resurrection and ascension. The Gospel of John goes further still, indicating that Mary was almost like a coach to Jesus, right? That like when he was growing up and it was time for him to perform his first miracle, she pushed him into it because she was so aware of Jesus' calling. But Mark doesn't contain any of those stories. In fact, Mark doesn't have any positive references to Jesus' family whatsoever, not even his mother. There are only 3 references to Jesus' family in the Gospel of Mark. They're not necessarily negative, but they suggest that there was some misunderstanding and some tension between Jesus and his family members. Now, I don't think that this means that Jesus' relationship with Mary wasn't valid or good or strong. I think that, as anybody knows who's been in families, both of those things can be true. You can love a family member and have these kind of tense interactions with them at times. But the Gospel of Mark forces us to focus on that more uncomfortable dynamic that Jesus had with his family. The tension, the distance, the challenge that it was for them to be related to the Son of God. So let's look at the actual instances in Mark when this relationship with his family comes up. The first one comes, 2 of them actually come from chapter 3, the passages that Sabrina just read for us a few moments ago. The first part of it is just a single verse that comes earlier in the chapter after Jesus had called the 12 apostles and brought them together in his home. And they say, when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him. For people were saying, he has gone out of his mind. Now, when you read this by itself, it's not necessarily clear to us what their intentions were, right? I mean, if people were saying that Jesus had gone out of his mind, then maybe they were just genuinely concerned about him and they wanted to check on his well-being. But that word restrain has a very negative connotation in the Gospel of Mark. It suggests that they were uncomfortable with what Jesus was doing, that they wanted to stop him or at least slow him down. And that's understandable in light of the times. Because in Jesus' day and age, everything that you said and did reflected on your family. Now, I suppose you could say that's true in any day and age, that, if we do things that it reflects on our parents or something to some degree. But if that's true in our society, it's 10 times more true, or it was 10 times more true in Jesus' time. Because in Jesus' time, family was first and foremost. If you were trying to get a job or some kind of a position, the first question that people ask you was not, what's your work experience, where did you get your training, but who's your family? Because if your family were good, reliable, competent people, then it was assumed that you would be a good, reliable, competent person too. And family status was something that was always vulnerable to change. So if one individual does something great and admirable in society, the entire family reputation could go up, and people would trust you more and honor you more and be inclined to invite you into higher levels of society. If, on the other hand, someone in your family did something that was controversial or shameful, then everybody around you would be inclined to back away from your family, because they assumed that you must have gotten it from them, and that reputation is kind of contagious. Maybe something that you do affects them, and so other people don't want to be touched by it as well. And so Jesus' family likely wanted to go and visit him, at least in part because they were being affected by the things that Jesus was saying and doing. It had a backlash that touched their lives. And we can know this with a fair degree of confidence because the third reference to Jesus' family, the one that occurs outside of Mark chapter 3, occurs when Jesus is visiting his hometown in Nazareth. And when he's there, people start talking about Jesus. And this is what they say. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Now, in this case, the emphasis is on the fact that when Jesus was visiting and presenting himself as this great teacher, this Messiah, that they thought, hang on a second, that can't be true because we know his family and his family members are just ordinary people. But that kind of thinking was a two-way street. If they associated Jesus that closely with Mary and his brothers and his sisters, then the things that he was doing, the things that caused offense, likely made them take offense at Mary and his brothers and sisters too. So we can understand why there was some tension in that family and why they went to at least talk with Jesus, at least try to negotiate with him about what he was doing, because they had a stake in the game. So then we jump down to the third section where Jesus interacts with his family, down in verse 31. And then it's when they arrive. And it says, then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around Jesus, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? Whoa. That was an offensive comment. Now, you have to remember, in ancient times, not only was family a big deal, but hospitality was a big deal. If someone showed up at your door, you should let them in. You could very easily offend people by dishonoring them. And imagine to have your own mother and brothers travel to see you, and they come out and call for you, and instead of letting them in, you say, who are my mother and brothers? It's almost like saying, I don't know you. I don't recognize you as having any special right as my family members. That would have been a deeply shocking thing to hear in Jesus' day and age. And indeed, that is the last interaction that Jesus has with his family in the Gospel of Mark. Even when he goes to Nazareth in chapter 6, people talk about his family, but we don't see them show up as Jesus travels through the town. So what's going on there? Is Jesus just saying that we should cast aside all family bonds, that God doesn't want us to love and care for our families? Well, that doesn't quite fit with the Gospel of Mark either. Because there are also several points in Mark's Gospel where Jesus emphasizes that we should be in relation to our families, that we should have special care for our family members. I'll just highlight a couple of them quickly here. In Mark chapter 7, when Jesus is debating with the Pharisees and the scribes, one issue that he points out in particular that bothers him about them is this practice they have of being able to say, we don't have to give money to our parents. We don't have to support our parents anymore. We're going to give that money to God instead. And Jesus says, how dare you? How dare you forget your obligation as sons and daughters to care for your parents under some pretense of following God? God tells us to honor our fathers and mothers. So clearly, Jesus thought there was some value in staying connected to your parents. And then a few chapters later, some of the same individuals come up to Jesus and they ask him if it's lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason. And Jesus could have very easily said yes. Perhaps they would have thought that he would have said yes, because after all, he had these disciples around him who seemed to have left their families, perhaps even some of their spouses, to come and follow him. But actually, he says, no, that is not okay. And I know that this is a passage that gets complicated when we're thinking about modern divorce. That is a valid thing to wrestle with. It's not really where I want to go with this morning. I think the point that he wanted to make is that it wasn't okay for men to simply leave their wives because they had some other religious interest. Just like the Pharisees couldn't just ditch their parents out of some pretense of following God. The family bonds were important. And just a few verses after that, Jesus has this interaction with children in which people are trying to keep children away from him. But he says, no, let the children come to me, because children were important to Jesus. And if Jesus cared about children, then he must have cared about their connections with their parents, because children cannot thrive without invested in parents or parental figures or adults in their lives. So it doesn't seem that Jesus is trying to break up families. It doesn't seem like that's the intent. So what is this questioning, this who are my mother and brothers question all about? Well, I think we can get some insight into that if we go back just before that first appearance with Jesus' family. After Jesus had called the 12 disciples, this very short passage notes that Jesus went home. That's a key word for understanding this entire concept. Jesus went to his own house. This was apparently not a house that he shared with his mother and brothers anymore. It's one that he had as an adult. But it was his home that he was inviting people into. And this is significant because the home is a major element of the rest of the conversation they have, but also that in Greek, the word for home, oikos, is the same as the word that's used for family. So here in Mark chapter 3, in a symbolic way, Jesus is inviting all of these new people, these apostles, some of whom had some questionable backgrounds, like a tax collector and a zealot, even these larger crowds of people who included who knows who, into his house, into his family. And this seemed to be the factor that his biological family was reacting to in particular. This is what made them come to meet him. Then when we get down later to chapter 31, we notice something, that when Jesus' mother and brothers arrive, they stand outside of his house. They don't go inside, but they call him to come out. Because presumably they don't want to be too closely associated with all of these unpredictable characters whom Jesus has invited inside his own home. Now, fortunately, we know from later history that the joke would be on them because they would become very intermingled with the people whom Jesus had invited into those houses. Jesus' brothers and his mother would be very involved in the Christian movement that would come. But at least at that moment, they were choosing to stand outside when they very well could have walked into the house and talked to Jesus himself. And it was at that moment that Jesus gives his shocking response. When he looks at those around him, and he reaffirms how important they are into his family. He says, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother." So what is this all about? Well, I think, first of all, it is not about us having too much love for anyone. I don't think that God is in some kind of a envious position thinking, oh man, that person loves their child too much or loves their parents too much and I want them to love me more. That's not how God is operating here. What this is coming out of is a broader desire to love even more people. Because I think one uncomfortable thing that we have to acknowledge is that family structures, even the close bonds between family members, can act as an oppressive institution. When we are bonded to our own family and acting just out of the interests of our own family, we can end up hurting God's people, intentionally or not. Now, one example of this in modern times is related to something that you might have heard people talking about in recent years, the racial wealth gap. We talk about the fact that white Americans hold a huge percentage of the wealth in society, far disproportionate to how many white people there are in society. And this is a big portion of the reason why cycles of poverty continue. And white people continue to hold on to power over against other groups, particularly African Americans. Now, the history of this might seem kind of obvious to us. We know that when many African Americans were first brought to this country, they were stripped of all of their wealth. They were made to be slaves. They were put in a position where they had nothing. And then for hundreds of years, there were oppressive policies that made sure that they couldn't build up wealth. And if they did build it up, it was often destroyed by mobs and violent means. But starting in the late 1960s, things really started to change. There were new laws, there was a change of hearts in at least the majority culture of society that recognized that all people should be given equal opportunities and that discrimination on the basis of race or color was wrong. So you would expect that to be the moment when things started to change in our history. But the fact is that between 1968 and now, the racial wealth gap has widened. It's actually gotten worse. And I don't think that that's because that there have been particularly oppressive policies. There have been some. That's a part of it. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think that's the sole reason. It's certainly not because people of color have not built on those opportunities. There have been plenty of businesses and universities and all sorts of successful ventures that have come out. I think that one of the primary reasons is because where white people often draw the line in sharing their wealth and being equitable is when it comes to their own family members. That, okay, maybe in general that we advocate that everybody should have an equal chance to get into Harvard or Yale or some reputable school. But when it comes to my kids, I'm going to, pull on my own connections, on ancestors who have been to those places to try to get them in over others. The ways that perhaps white people have, out of fear of the other, pulled out of neighborhoods and school systems and have pulled valuable resources with them, leaving those places underfunded, have oftentimes been out of a genuine concern for their own families, but in a way that throws other families under the bus. And it's not just with these big societal things such as race where this kind of thing can happen. This kind of dynamic of being biased toward our families can cause harm in several different ways, even at the micro level of a church. When churches, for example, make an effort to celebrate holidays like Mother's Day and Father's Day in ways that are designed to make kind of what you think of as the stereotypical nuclear family feel good, then they're often reinforcing pain and alienation in the lives of those who don't have those backgrounds or experiences. Or if we make decisions about when and where we are going to have church services so that people can be with their family members, not thinking about those folks who perhaps have had abusive family members, perhaps have lost family members, who have made the choice to make the church their primary family, we are acting in ways that look at our own individual family over against the interests of other people. And that is the thing that Christ challenges. Because you see, when Christ said, "Here in this room are my mother and sister and brothers," anybody was welcome to come in that room. Jesus would love for entire biological families to come into these kinds of spaces together. But the statement that he was making was that in this context of the family that he was establishing in his own home, the family of Christ, there are not separate tiers in it. It's not that Jesus just cares about himself and his own kids and his own sisters and brothers and his own mother first and foremost, and then gets to other people as there's time and space for it. Now, certainly it's true that we might have special connections, special obligations that to people that we have unique relationships to, but in the church, you all, my brothers and sisters here, are as close to me and important to me as my real biological sister. Your children are my children. Even if you don't have children, my children are your children. To be a part of the family of God is to say that the blood that binds us together is not the blood of any particular gene pool or family line, but only the blood of Christ, which we share whenever we come together as a body of God's people.